No mai, haere mai, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. The United States has been isolating Russian President Vladimir Putin since Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. But this week, the US and Russia have held face-to-face talks to try and deal with the conflict in Ukraine. And US President Donald Trump has said that he is likely to meet Vladimir Putin before the end of the month. We seem to be in uncharted waters. What's next? Welcome, Robert.
Right, Bruce. Thank you.
How momentous are these developments?
I think they're momentous bilaterally, internationally, and also in terms of international institutions. Bilaterally, Mr. Trump has done a complete about-face in terms of America's approach to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Relations between the United States and Russia have effectively been in cold storage since Russia illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, and that process intensified when Mr. Putin launched a full-scale and illegal invasion of Ukraine in 2020, February 2022 actually. And so Mr. Trump has reversed that course and has already said, he's already made a number of concessions to Mr. Putin before the substantive talks get underway. He said Ukraine can't join NATO, apparently, and also that Ukraine must be prepared to lose territory, which was, of course, gained through an invasion. So that's all quite a break from the past. In terms of alliances, in the broader international picture, I think it's fair to say that transatlantic relations are now at crisis point. And Mr. Trump's broadside against President Zelensky in the last 24 hours has probably accelerated the process of a possible rift between the transatlantic allies in Europe, who simply do not share Mr. Trump's understanding of reality when it comes to the Ukraine war.
Right, and I wanted to ask about that because Ukraine wasn't invited to this first round of talks between Russia and the US, and Europe has had to listen to a speech from US Vice President J.D. Vance saying that its alleged censorship was more of a danger than Russia. Are we on course for a US-Russia alliance against a Ukraine-Europe bloc?
Well, if you were to believe the words that came out of the meeting between Russia and the US in Saudi Arabia, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, spoke about the prospects of a geopolitical partnership between Russia and the United States. He said it had tremendous potential and tremendous potential benefits, but he didn't spell out any of the benefits. So I think this is an extraordinary situation. I think what we really need to grapple with is why was Zelensky kept out of the talks? After all, it's his country that's been invaded. This is an extraordinary situation. It's even more extraordinary when you consider that this conflict could be over in 12 hours if Mr. Putin simply withdrew his illegal presence from neighbouring Ukraine. So why is it Mr. Trump, so-called strongman leader, he always describes himself as very strong and how he doesn't have time for weakness, why hasn't he demanded that Mr. Putin withdraw his troops to the internationally recognised borders of Russia? And so there's something very, very odd here.
Are you able to hazard a guess? What is going on here?
It's very difficult to read it, Bruce, because Mr. Trump has had a consistent soft spot for Mr. Putin going back to his first administration. He certainly repeats many of Putin's talking points, not just about Ukraine, but about NATO. And I think there are real concerns, both in Europe and in the UK now, that Trump is poised to withdraw the United States from NATO. But that, of course, is not necessarily a tragedy for the Europeans. It will force them to take much more responsibility. And on paper, they're more than a match for anything Russia can offer. So what they do know quite clearly, what the Europeans know, is they cannot rely on the Trump administration in a way they relied on the Biden administration. And so that's going to it is forcing a reassessment. And they do have at their disposal $300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets, which they could confiscate and then hand to the Ukraine, which might make up for the shortfall in the reduction of US funding. So I think the situation could turn around quickly. When I say turn around, obviously things are not looking particularly bright for the moment for Ukraine and Mr. Zelensky, who feels abandoned by the United States.
I'm wondering what all of this means for New Zealand. And I know that you're going to say what's going on is a dangerous example of power politics compared with the rules-based system that a small trading nation like New Zealand depends on. But I'm wondering, what could that danger look like in practice, and how soon could we actually be facing it?
Well, let's look at some practical examples, Bruce, of what may happen. Now, these are hypothetical, but they do flow from a situation of a geopolitical partnership between Putin's authoritarian state and the most powerful country in the world, the United States, under Mr. Trump's leadership. One of the reasons, you asked me just previously, why is Mr. Trump doing this? One of the reasons that's been speculated is that Mr. Trump is trying to break the relationship between Russia and China in order to focus American pressure on China. But that makes no sense at all, because by making concessions to Mr. Putin, China, which is the biggest backer of Russia, is watching very closely. They see this as American weakness. Through Chinese eyes, America is the most powerful country in the world and should be using its power against Russia. So they're not impressed. What's more, China will be emboldened. If Mr. Putin gets away with changing borders by force and keeping the proceeds, China may well be tempted to become more assertive in our part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific. One area where we've got great concerns at the moment is the Cook Islands. But China's not just interested in the Cook Islands. It's interested in many Pacific Island states. So one spin-off might be that China becomes much more assertive in a key region for New Zealand, which is the Pacific Island nations region. A second spin-off, which has implications for a very important country for New Zealand, is Japan. New Zealand has repeatedly said it wants to elevate relations with Japan. It's a liberal democracy we see as a way of diversifying away from China if possible. It doesn't have the complications that China does from a New Zealand point of view, because China's an authoritarian state like Russia, whereas Japan is a liberal democracy. Japan has a long-standing territorial dispute with Russia over a group of islands known as the Kuril Islands. This goes back to 1945. Now, if Mr. Putin succeeds in the fruits of his invasion being kept, then he may well press other areas in the Indo-Pacific where he has interests, and Japan is one of them. And if Mr. Trump's in a new geopolitical partnership with Japan, who's to say that the United States will come to Japan's aid? After all, Mr. Trump has turned on its head the transatlantic partnership, and all the old certainties of US identification with Europe seem to be over. So some of the old certainties about Japan being challenged by Russia may also evaporate. So these are worrying things for New Zealand, and that is practical examples how the erosion of a rules-based order have direct ramifications for our security in the Indo-Pacific.
So should we be taking a step? Should our government be doing anything, or should we be keeping our heads below the radar, as it were?
I think the government, like many governments, is trying to maintain a cordial relationship with the Trump administration, but the Trump administration is showing no such constraint when it comes to our interests. By entering into a possible geopolitical partnership with Russia and saying Russia can keep the gains of an invasion effectively, Mr. Trump is directly challenging the national interests of this country. We're a small trader. We trade with more than 100 countries around the world. We need rules. Rules there for the weak, as we often say. Mr. Trump doesn't have any concern about that. So Mr. Trump is challenging New Zealand's worldview. Does New Zealand sit on the sidelines and say nothing as Mr. Trump begins to dismantle the rules-based order. In short, New Zealand may have to make some tough choices in the not distant future. Already, the European countries led by Germany are expressing solidarity with Canada. In fact, the German ambassador to Canada said, "We've got your back." We haven't said that yet. But can we afford to sit on the sidelines? Because the Europeans, if they have a big rift with the United States, and it looks like the UK is included in that now, they will not take kindly to New Zealand sitting on its hands. So New Zealand has to make up its mind. Does it share the vision of the European partners of a rules-based international order based on multilateral security arrangements, or does it prefer to take risks with Mr. Trump in perhaps a geopolitical partnership with Russia?
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.